impact of expanded natural gas resources in the energy future of the Americas. Now, several countries in the Americas boast abundant natural gas resources, and historically, conventional gas has been the focus of most of the energy industry's exploration. However, most of the growth in supply in recent years is derived from unconventional formations such as tight gas, coal bed methane, gas hydrates, and shale gas. Technological breakthroughs have made these supplies commercially viable. Our guest speakers today will have an opportunity to address this topic and some specific topics within this field. I would like to mention that interpretation services will be available throughout the meeting and for the conclusions as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Cletus Springer, Director of the Department of Sustainable Development.
Many thanks, Juan Cruz, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm not going to speak long. The less I say, the more opportunity you have to say your bit. And my main purpose here behind the microphone is to welcome you and to thank especially our panelists who have taken time from their schedules to be with us: Bill Becker, Ramon Espinaza, Francisco Gonzalez, and Lisa Faciti. I know this is a traditional holiday period for Washington, D.C., but you seem to have laid that, made that thought moot by your presence here this afternoon. I want to take the opportunity to introduce Ambassador Mendez, who's going to be speaking on behalf of Ambassador Passan, who was originally carded to speak with us today. Ambassador Mendez is a very good friend of the Department of Sustainable Development. He has been an ambassador since 2008, and that came at the end of a very long and distinguished career in the field of diplomacy. Ambassador Mendez has a strong interest in development generally, but more especially in the area of diversified energy matrices. And with that background, I want to ask you to join me in welcoming Ambassador Mendez to the podium.
Thank you very much, Mr. Springer, and good afternoon to all of you. I know that usually being asked to speak after lunch can be particularly challenging, especially if some of us have indulged a little more than the normal in the intake. But it's great to be here. I want to thank Mr. Springer and the organizers for consistently putting together these panels that speak to issues that are absolutely important and interesting and will keep growing in importance for our region. As Mr. Springer said, Ambassador Parsan, who had been requested to be here today, could not make it because he had to travel unexpectedly to Mexico. And he honored me requesting that if I could please step in and pretend to know a little about energy in the Americas. And I told him, I would be happy to do so. I can't pretend to know more than the little I know, but it certainly is a topic that is of the absolute greatest importance for Belize, for Central America, for the Caribbean, in fact, for all of us here and for all of the Americas. As the representative of a developing country, I am only too acutely aware of the national imperative of having a secure, dependable, affordable source of energy to power our development. However, as the representative of Belize, we have the additional burden that we also have branded ourselves internationally and our tourism product as being one that is immediately linked with environmental sustainability and conservation. In fact, our tourism product is ecotourism. It's solidly anchored in conservation and environmental protective policies. So for us, the whole issue of renewable energy goes beyond just the supply of energy to power our development. It is also an absolutely critical part of our tourism product, which is one of the pillars of our economy. So everything is linked, therefore I am more than happy to be here today. I want to touch on three issues this afternoon. First of all, I want to give you a sense of the energy matrix landscape in Belize and what we're doing to live up to our word to provide the energy for our development while maintaining our anchor on environmental and conservation policies. That's the first one. Second of all, I want to touch a little on this very big and very important development in Central America, which is the CEPAC, the Central American Integrated Energy System, which I think will transform the entire Central American corridor. As a matter of fact, it will transform Mesoamerica, everything from Mexico all the way down to Colombia. It is that big and that important. And thirdly, I want to touch on a bigger issue, more of a political and policy issue. Where does the OAS fit in a real and practical way in these big issues that are being discussed, that are so important and will impact our countries in such a tremendous fashion? What is the place of the OAS, the political bodies? What can the OAS do? And especially at this particular moment in the organization when we're looking to recalibrate the entire emphasis and the work of the organization through this strategic vision process, the review process. So first, let me tell you a little about Belize. We have a Ministry of Energy, which has been tasked with the development of a national sustainable energy strategy, which is supposed to cover the period 2012 to 2033. So by the time I'm just starting to become a young man, we're going to start to see the fruits of the planning. The main purpose, the main focus of the strategy is to transition the country to a low-carbon economy by 2030. Now, I know a lot of policy units in the different countries have these big objectives that they put out there. And so we try to be a little more concrete, a little more specific about how we're planning to do it. And so some of the basic pillars to achieve this have been determined to be improved energy efficiency and conservation. If we're more efficient, we conserve more. Development of domestic energy sources. This ties into the whole issue of energy security. There is no country that can be secure as a nation if it does not have, in addition to whatever stable sources of energy, if it does not have some basic national resources to utilize in the case of an absolute emergency. Facilitation of private sector participation and investment in the low carbon energy, among other things. So we realize that whereas the government is the one who needs to provide the environment to ensure that there is energy in the country, governments are not generally in the business of generating energy. That is a function for the private sector, and they do it better than anybody else. At the moment, our energy matrix includes energy from fossil fuels, from biomass, hydropower, and to a very limited extent, solar and wind. We have not developed the capacity for utilizing natural energy to any significant extent. I know that in Belize there have been attempts, more of a domestic level, to retrofit some trucks and some pickup trucks and some heavy-duty vehicles to be able to work using butane gas and other natural gases. And I don't think that that has become widespread because we don't have the systems in place. First of all, if you're driving a car and you run out of gas, you go into a gasoline station. If your truck runs on butane gas and you run out of gas, it's very difficult for you to find a resupply nearby. For us, the systems are not there. The structures have not been put in place for that. However, although about 70% of our macro energy use comes from fossil fuels, if we look specifically at the electricity sector, up to today we have about 65% installed capacity in renewable energy. So if we remove just the electric energy sector from the entire energy, the global energy use of the country, we realize that 65% of the electricity is generated from hydro and from biomass. Those are renewables, and we're moving to expand those. We also are working to do some investments in solar. We have 2 experimental farms that have been set up, and we're also looking at wind power. However, when it comes to wind power, the feasibility studies have indicated that the wind maps point to only certain places in the country that would have the capacity to generate significant amounts of energy from wind. And some of these places are in the more inaccessible parts of the country, usually in the higher elevations. So that presents an immediate obstacle to the development of this. I'm not saying that it won't be done. It eventually could be done when we have the technology that is affordable and when there is an additional need for this kind of energy. I said that about 70% of our global energy comes from fossil fuels. And that is because most of it goes into the transport sector. Now remember, our economy is anchored in ecotourism, in agriculture. We're moving into other directions like international business processing. We do a lot of production of agricultural goods for export. And many of these industries are energy intensive in terms of the transport sector. You need heavy duty machinery for agriculture. You need diesel trucks for moving sugarcane and bananas and citrus. And so an important part of our energy consumption goes into the transport sector. At some point, I am sure that we will need to look at retrofitting of the national fleet to see how we can decrease the energy consumption in this area. The good news is that even as we speak, there is another sugar mill being installed in Belize. And this sugar mill, which will double our sugar output, is just like the one we have at the moment, will include at the end of process section biomass energy generating facility that will, if all the estimates are correct, should generate about 35 megawatts for the national grid. For a country the size of Belize, that is quite significant. Last November, the government of Belize put out a request for proposals for companies interested in generating energy for national consumption. And the purpose really is in the next 10 years to add at least 60 megawatts of firm capacity and 15 megawatts of solar or wind for the national grid. That is looking at our energy expansion needs in the next 10 years. As I said at the beginning, it is extremely important to us that as we develop our country, the energy that goes into this development does not affect the development in the medium term, especially because so much of our economy depends directly on renewable and on maintaining the environment and remaining true to our conservation policies. So generally, that's where we are in terms of where we are in Belize. Now, I want to talk a little about CEPAC, because I think that this particular initiative has the potential to transform our entire region. And why is that? Those who are not familiar with it, it is the CEPAC, it is the acronym in Spanish, Sistema Integrado de Energía para América Central. It's for Central America. And it links everything from Mexico all the way down to Panama and eventually with Colombia. I think they're already starting the work, at least the negotiations to put in place the infrastructure for it. Now you may ask, why is this significant for Belize? When I say it has the potential, clearly I'm looking at my country. I'm also looking at the entire region, but I'm also looking at Belize in the first instance. And why is that important? Because right now our economy is of such a small size that when we are trying to attract those companies that generate electricity, sometimes they're reluctant to come because they won't be able to achieve economies of scale due to the low domestic demand, relatively speaking. However, if you think that when the CEPAC is fully installed and operational, you would have a market, if you include the south of Mexico, of over 75 million people with middle-level industry already going full bloom. It is significant. The demand, the market is huge. Therefore, a country like Belize would not only be able to generate for domestic consumption, but if we're able to advance in our capacity to develop renewable sources of energy, whatever excess we produce, we could upload it to this massive market, this massive grid that will always need energy. And if something were to happen, from which we can always get our energy from this massive installed capacity to produce and use. The investment is tremendous. Some figures I saw pointed to the IDB's intervention at over $3.3 billion in the first phase. I know the negotiations are going on, and sometimes these negotiations can be very difficult because we're talking about connecting across borders. And I know that some of the panelists will be talking precisely about this, transboundary energy agreements, and the regulation across the borders, the transmission fees. All of those are extremely complex and can be perhaps daunting. But I think that the political will is there. I think that we are a little beyond the point in Central America where we were thinking only about protecting those immediate borders. We're thinking in economic terms, the policy, the decision to integrate, I think, is real. And everybody realizes that having access to a consistent, to a stable, to a secure, to a bigger energy generating capacity is good for everyone. Therefore, I am keeping my fingers crossed, and very soon, hopefully, when we go out, we as Belize go out to look for people who want to come in and generate electricity, they will no longer be looking at a market of 340,000 people. They will be looking at a potential market of 75 million people. That is a very big transformation. Let me touch a little now on where the OAS stands in all of this. The OAS is the premier political body of the Americas. And these big issue discussions are necessarily a part of the discussions that should be taking place here. And I don't mean only at the technical level, at the level of the ECPA, as much as I am fully supportive and I believe in the work of the Unit for Sustainable Development. These kinds of issues need to be elevated to the political bodies. Right now, we are in the process of reviewing the strategic vision of the OAS. Where will it go? What are the big things that it will start looking at? There are so many things going on that need a macro level of attention. And energy integration in the Americas, in my opinion, is certainly one of these big issues on the same level as ICT development on the national scale, but also ICT integration across the Americas. In that same level, we have to look at energy integration across the Americas. And we have to find a place for the political bodies to engage in this discussion, because it cannot be relegated to the technical people. Energy integration is not only for ministers of energy, is not only for the engineers, is not only for the ministers of finance, is not only for the foreign ministers. Energy integration across countries is for a whole of a nation approach, and all the sectors have to be involved, especially the private sector. Because at the end of the day, they will be making the money, and they should be making the money. They're making the investments, and the role of the governments is to make sure that these developments can occur in a place that is as seamless and as user-friendly as possible. But that at the end of the day, the benefit will be for our people. Cheaper energy, consistent energy, secure energy, which all of us need to keep development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think, yes, we all agree the fact that the need for cheaper or as cheap as possible energy resources is something that is always present in the minds of those who think about solutions for these issues. And energy integration is definitely an aspect that we seek to work on at the OAS and from the perspective of the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas. I would like to ask our guest speakers to take a seat. And in the meantime, we're going to show a video that we produced for ECPA, which shows a little bit, our work in the region over the last year since ECPA was created at the Summit of the Americas in 2009 in Trinidad. Thank you.
El mundo mejora nuestras vidas, asegura que nuestras fábricas sigan funcionando, ayuda a cuidar a los enfermos, educa a nuestros hijos, transporta la comida, los bienes y a los demás por todo el mundo. Mientras el hemisferio se desarrolla, la necesidad por la energía sigue aumentando. Mientras este crecimiento se acelera, también se aumenta la polución, el uso de combustibles fósiles y el cambio climático.
Tenemos que encontrar soluciones para las generaciones del futuro.
La energía es un recurso esencial, pero más de 30 millones de personas en América carecen de ella.
En muchas áreas rurales hace falta asistencia médica. Hay familias que sufren sin tener acceso a la energía limpia y moderna.
La Alianza de la Energía y el Clima para las Américas, ECPA, está trabajando para cambiar esto.
ECPA promueve la cooperación entre gobiernos y asociaciones que implementen proyectos de la energía limpia que beneficien a comunidades en Latinoamérica y el Caribe.
ECPA está ayudando en la construcción de estufas limpias y eficientes para erradicar la contaminación y peligros de fuego en la casa.
ECPA está trabajando para reducir emisiones de carbono, con el desarrollo de rutas seguras para bicicletas.
ECPA está ayudando a Cocafelol cómo producir energía a partir de los residuos naturales de café para generar nuevos ingresos.
ECPA está enseñando a los demás cómo producir energía a partir de los desechos orgánicos para mejorar el futuro.
ECPA está distribuyendo linternas solares en pueblos pequeños que están desconectados de la cuadrícula eléctrica para que las personas puedan leer, estudiar o disfrutar actividades en la casa durante la noche.
ECPA está trabajando con muchas universidades para enseñar los impactos del cambio de clima sobre el medio ambiente.
Por lo tanto, la evidencia, el resultado que logremos generar con este proyecto puede beneficiar a todos los países que están en la región.
El cambio climático ya no es una profecía y se ha convertido en una realidad inquietante. Su impacto adverso le hace daño al futuro de nuestros hijos.
El cambio es posible.
Usted puede hacer la diferencia.
Apoya la energía renovable.
Apoya ECPA.
Tenemos que construir un futuro que ilumine la vida de hombres y mujeres en Latinoamérica.
Tu energía mueve al mundo.
Descubre el poder de tu participación.
Juntos podemos.
Juntos podemos.
Juntos podemos.
Juntos podemos.
Juntos podemos.
Sí se puede.
¡Sí se puede!
Thank you. So that's a little video that we produced, and the images that are shown are actual images of projects that were financed through ECPA in Central America. I would like to introduce you to our guest for today, Mr. William Becker, to my left. He's Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Action Project and Senior Project Advisor for the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University. Mr. Becker is a former senior official at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he spent 15 years leading programs to accelerate the commercialization of energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies. We also have today with us Dr. Ramon Espinaza. He's the lead oil and gas specialist at the Energy Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. From 1979 to 1999, he worked at Petróleos de Venezuela, where he was chief economist. And And today also Dr. Espinaza is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches 2 postgraduate seminars on world and hemispheric energy security. Dr. Francisco Gonzalez is Senior Associate Professor of Latin American Studies at the Johns Hopkins University, Paul Nix School of Advanced International Studies, and his research interests include the economic and geopolitical impact of the shale revolution in the energy and climate change policies of countries in the Americas. And last but not least, Ms. Lisa Vicidi, and she's Director of the Inter-American Dialogue Program on Energy and Climate Change and Extractive Industries. Ms. Vicidi has written numerous reports and articles on energy policy, climate change, social and environmental impacts of natural resources development, and the geopolitics of energy, among other topics. So I would like to start with Bill today, and I think you're going to talk to us a little bit about natural gas and LNG as a toward low carbon energy sources.
I am. You can hear me, yes, okay. Very pleased to be here, Ambassador. Thank you for your remarks. You, in a way, introduced a little bit about what I'd like to discuss, and that's the nexus between natural gas and the environment. As you all know, natural gas presents a wonderful opportunity in a climate-constrained economy, global economy, to make the transition to even cleaner resources. The United States, as you probably also know, is now the leading producer of natural gas in the world. And so we've learned a few lessons, as many have, about what the potential is and what the potential problems are. So I'd like to discuss both. In the United States today, natural gas is increasingly replacing coal in the generation of electricity. And that's partially the reason why we've had some progress in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, some progress. In North America, the production of natural gas has grown 30% in recent years, leading to an oversupply and lower prices. I expect that will end. Value creation is anticipated to be somewhere around $700 billion by 2030. LNG represents about 10% of the global gas market today. It's grown 7-fold since 2002. LNG, as many of you know, is what we need to do to natural gas in order to export it. It is liquefied at the plants where it departs and regasified at the plants where it is received. It takes 600 times less space in a ship to store LNG than natural gas, and that's why it's so valuable as a resource to plug the supply and demand gaps in the world market. There's some uncertainty over future prices. Buyers have been a little bit reluctant to sign long-term contracts, but I think we're going to see great growth in LNG. And there's tremendous investments being made in these very expensive facilities right now. Now, whether natural gas and LNG, and I'll refer to both generically as natural gas, meet their promise as a transition fuel into a low-carbon global economy depends on our ability to solve several problems or to surmount several hurdles that make the gas a little bit of an environmental issue in many, many countries, including the United States. How many of you are familiar with fracking or hydraulic fracturing? All right, some of you, I'll explain it very quickly for those who are not. The conventional supplies of natural gas, where gas seeped through rock formations into pools, and they were fairly easy to access, oil and gas, are pretty much expired, pretty much gone. Now there have been some new technologies that allow us to sink a well and crack formations where gas is trapped and cannot migrate into those pools. We're using liquids to do this under pressure. It's called hydraulic fracturing, or fracking for short, although the industry doesn't like that term. A number of issues have arisen because of the fracking process, and one of the key ones is the contents of the fracking fluids, and especially the chemicals in those fluids. They tend to be water and sand and a number of chemicals. And the industry has been reluctant to reveal the contents of those chemicals, because they consider them, at least here in the United States, to be trade secrets. But the industry also is concerned about keeping its so-called social license to operate. In other words, public support for its industry. And so we're seeing a movement toward more disclosure of these chemicals now, but still not 100% transparency. And there's a lot of concern, especially where gas is being produced near people, about what these chemicals are doing to groundwater supplies. I think that the trend needs to be toward a disclosure of these chemicals, even if it's to public health agencies who keep it confidential, so that there's some confidence in the fracking process. The second issue has to do with wastewater during that drilling process. There's 4 ways to treat this water, often saline, containing minerals, and sometimes the fracking agents. One is to treat it like you would treat dirty water and discharge it as clean water. The second is to recycle it and use it over and over again. The third is to store it in surface ponds. And a fourth is to inject it back into the wells. The injection is turning out to be a rather popular option, except that it seems to be causing seismic activity. In the state of Oklahoma, for example, researchers have concluded that there have been 2,500 earthquakes, mostly small but some sizable, since 2008. And they attribute this to the injection of wastewater into deep wells. There's less proof of a link between the fracturing agents, the hydraulic fracturing, and these seismic activities, but they do attribute it to wastewater. Several states, I should say, are studying this right now besides Oklahoma, Ohio, California, and Texas, for example. Another issue that comes up is jurisdictional. In the United States, our states regulate the gas industry, but increasingly around the United States, communities want to take control. They want to be able to ban the drilling near their population centers. And there's a struggle going on between the states and communities now about who has the authority to regulate natural gas production. And some states rule one way, other states rule other ways. I imagine this is going to go eventually to the US Supreme Court, where it'll have to be resolved. As a result of, I should mention also methane leaks. Natural gas is principally methane. And research has shown that if the leaks of this methane from the wellheads, from the pipelines, from the storage tanks, and even from the vehicles that use this fuel, if those leaks exceed 3.2% of total production, gas has no advantage from a carbon standpoint over coal. So plugging those leaks is an extraordinarily important issue in order to keep natural gas's role as a clean fuel, a relatively clean fuel, and a transition fuel. One other big issue that may come to fruition next December 2015 are the recent scientific findings that if we care to keep global warming at 2 degrees centigrade or Celsius above industrial levels, pre-industrial levels, we need to keep 80% of our proven fossil energy reserves worldwide in the ground. We cannot extract them and use them. And I expect this will come up in a big way, as I mentioned, next December, a year from this December, when there's supposed to be the culmination of these decades of international negotiations over climate change. I expect this will be an issue. And it may end up constraining our ability to extract resources that we know are there. It may strand some of those resources, and it may have an impact on the energy companies that depend for their value on those resources. Now, a combination of these issues have caused several countries to ban production, especially hydraulic fracturing. Among them are Bulgaria, Romania, Germany, France, one region of Spain. UK had such a ban, but it lifted it in 2012. But we can see that these issues are not just here in the Americas or in Central America, in South America. They're worldwide. And they're going to have to be dealt with in order for natural gas to really, as I said at the beginning, fulfill its potential, very important potential as a transition fuel to the new energy economy.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. That's very interesting. I didn't know about plugging the leaks, and if you don't plug those leaks, then you're pretty much at the same level as you would be with regular coal. That's, wow, that's very interesting. That really isn't a big issue if you want to use gas, natural gas, as a potential transition fuel. So, yeah. So I would like to now offer the floor to
Ramon.
Ramon. And yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the OAS, for their kind invitation, particularly Alejandra and Now, who make sure that I would be here today. And thank you all for attending. Thank you, Ambassador Mendez, for your very thoughtful remarks. I'll talk the impact of this gas revolution that is taking place in the Western Hemisphere in two regions of the Western Hemisphere that are particularly dependent on imported energy, are by far net importers of energy. And in those two regions are located the poorest countries in the continent. These are the Caribbean and Central America. And because of both, the fact that energy is imported and the technologies they use to produce electricity, they are producing the dearest electricity in the Western Hemisphere. In the Caribbean, countries such as Dominican Republic, Haiti, Grenada, Jamaica, Barbados, or Guyana produce electricity that is between 2 and 3-fold the price of the US. US is around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. In these countries, Guyana is 24. The other extreme is paradoxically the poorest country in the region, Haiti, 35, or Dominican Republic, 40 cents the kilowatt hour. The other region that is also a net importer of energy and is paying very expensive electricity is Central America. Countries such as the poorest countries in Central America, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, are paying prices for the electricity that are between 50 and 100% higher than the US. The reason for that is that in the case of the Caribbean, with the exception of Trinidad that produces out of gas, the rest of the countries produce electricity out of liquid fuels with very old technologies that generates very expensive electricity. And there is a high social cost of that energy. The same is the case in at least these three countries in Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and also Panama, that they are producing a good share of their electricity out of liquid-fired power plants. Then these countries are meant to benefit, if we know how to do it, out of this sudden change in the gas landscape in the Caribbean basin. And that's due to the revolution that is taking place in the US. The US was a large exporter of liquefied natural gas. Now it is not importing any more LNG. It's still importing gas from Canada. But then the gas that was coming into the Caribbean basin to supply the US now is idle and could supply these countries. Particularly the case of Trinidad, that was oriented mostly the gas from Trinidad oriented to the US. And also the case of Peru, that not many people think of as a supplier for the region. Peru is very close to Central America, and actually the bulk of the population in Central America lives on the Pacific seaboard. Then Peru could provide gas to the region. Then the landscape has changed, and I'm going to make a political reference. In a meeting, a presidential summit that took place in San Jose, Costa Rica in April last year, when President Obama visited the region, the presidents of Central American countries mandated the IDB to do a feasibility study for gas in Central America. Parallel to that, we prepared a study for the Caribbean. And both pre-feasibility studies showed that gas was a real alternative as a source of electricity in the region that could bring very expensive prices down in terms of electricity generation. The reason for this is not just that there is plentiful of gas or potential plentiful of gas in the region, but also technologies have changed. Both technologies for the transportation of gas. Now you have what they call small-scale LNG and compressed natural gas transportation, and also small-scale electricity combined cycle generation out of gas. This is particularly important, these technological developments, for supplying electricity to these very small economies. Nonetheless, as very correctly Ambassador Mendes pointed out, the themes of economies of scale are very important. And for having a gas solution for these two regions, you need to have coordinated action among countries. For both issues of minimum scales of transportation and storage and generation. Even though you have a smaller scale transportation, it's not these huge LNG vessels going to Korea or Japan. You can have a smaller vessels. Those vessels are too large for Central America or for individual countries in Central America and the Caribbean. Then you need to have hubs for generation. And I am going to make a specific reference to the solutions we have been working on at a very technical level, and this will be brought down to political decision. It's policymakers that take the last decision. Ambassador couldn't agree more. For Central America, the technical, most economic solution is to have two hubs, one in the south, another in the north. Perhaps Panama, to supply Panama, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua with a 600 megawatts plant. And another in the north, could be either in El Salvador or Guatemala, to supply El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And here comes how important the development of the ECPA that you refer at length is, because you will generate electricity in these two hubs and exchange or export the electricity to importing countries through the ECPA. It is so important, the ECPA development, that it's becoming insufficient. The amount of electricity being exchanged through ECPA is requiring at this moment a strengthening, not just the national lines of ECPA, but also the exchanges, the physical exchanges between countries. Then that could be a solution, but for that you need a coordinated action. As you had it for ECPA, you would have to have some sort of coordinated solution for having gas in Central America. Let me put it another way. Countries such as Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala itself, or El Salvador cannot have individual solutions. Their scales are not enough for having their own small fire gas or the import facilities for gas. Then you need to have coordinated action among countries. Guatemala could be supplied, and Mexico has been very active in this regard, via pipeline from Mexico. Mexico is the country that in the world is benefiting most of the US gas revolution, because they are getting gas at the border at Henry Hub. And then they are importing ever larger amounts of gas from the US, and will be able eventually to export gas to Central America via pipeline. That's the solution for the Central American region. For the Caribbean, you should have a similar solution. You need two hubs, most probably one in the south, most probably will be Trinidad, and another one in the north. You have already gas facilities in Dominican Republic, and from there, with very small vessels, have a shuttle service to supply the other nation states in the region, including Guyana and Suriname, from bigger hubs in these countries with a smaller scale plants. And for most countries, the gas solution is possible in the Caribbean also, as far as you have common facilities, at least for gasifying and storing gas. Then, as ECPA, as Ambassador Mendez was saying, has been a success after 20 years in the making. And it's coming to fruition, as you said, in this moment. Gas could be a big success for both the Caribbean and Central America. It shouldn't take that long because it's different projects. The solution has to be carried on by the private sector. The governments in the region don't have the savings for implementing these large investments, neither the technologies or the market access. And, but it will be an excellent situation for having private-public partnerships with power purchase agreements among countries. That implies, in the case of Central America, also changing the institutionality, expanding the institutionality of CEPAC. But again, that's a political issue, and if there is the will, the means will be there. I've been talking for some 12 minutes. Can I say a few words about South America? Gas is also looking into the future a solution for Central America. Gas is not that much present at this moment in the South America as it is not in the Central America or the Caribbean energy matrix. It could be. It is just present at a reasonable scale in Peru because they have plentiful. But gas will be part of the solution in the future. As you all know, Latin America is the cleanest continent on Earth, and that's in terms of energy generation. And that's particularly because of our huge hydro resources. But those hydro resources have been developed, a good deal of them. Then incremental capacity, looking over the next 20 to 30 years, will require thermogeneration, larger, increasing amounts of thermogeneration. The solution cannot be hydro plants, that the very big ones, the ones in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, were built 40, 50 years ago, in the 60s and 70s. That I always hide my age, then should be 40 to 50 years old, and they are coming to capacity. And you don't have any more Itaipus or Guris or these big dams. The big ones were already built. There is nothing of that scale in the future there. Incremental supply of electricity in South America will have to come from thermogeneration. There is a space for non-conventional renewable energy, but that's too small to cover the bulk of demand for any standards. Then the solution of gas for South America will also be there. And for that, the development of these large reserves that have not been tapped as yet will be necessary. Free gas in Venezuela, but non-conventional gas in the case of Argentina, or further development of gas in Peru and Bolivia. And they will have a market for electricity generation in the region. Then very concrete, what's going on in Central America and the Caribbean. Further into the future, the potential for gas in South America. And that will be it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramon. And definitely, yes, I mean, CEPAC does offer a very good example of the potential for energy integration it did take 20 years. So, and so these efforts need to be happening in other parts in our region, in other sub-regions, such as you pointed out, Caribbean. I think South America has a lot of potential for that kind of integration too, but 20 years is a long time. So, you know, there is something where there is going to have to be some political will to move the mechanisms a little bit quicker. I would like to invite Francisco to offer his conversation.
Thank you very much. Likewise, like Ramon, I'd like to thank Alejandra for the kind invitation, Ambassador Mendez for his remarks, my colleagues in the panel. I've got a few pictures just to try to keep you entertained. With the first one, just showing the contribution of different energy feedstocks to greenhouse gas emissions, where the first three are the main fossil fuels, and which show that natural gas, in terms of tons per CO2, we know that there are many other gases that contribute to rising temperatures on the surface of the planet, but CO2 as the yardstick, gas definitely beats oil or coal. Of course, when we move to renewables, nuclear is not a renewable, given the medium life, it's sometimes considered one. It's a different game. But really, in terms of the types of economies of scale that Ambassador Mendez, that Ramon Espinaza were talking about, to power economies, even small economies like Belize's or those of Central American or Caribbean countries, you are talking about a continued need of fossil fuels. Regarding mitigation, natural gas is definitely then the feedstock to try to continue to exploit, to try to continue to use. The next one. And here just just reiterating the point that Bill made regarding methane, given that more than 90% of natural gas is made of the most simple of hydrocarbons, which is one carbon and fourth hydrogens, metano. You see that when you look at, this is just the United States and the US 2012, with 116 million metric tons of methane leakage, that translates into 1,040 million metric tons of CO2. So methane leakage is a problem. It's estimated that between 1 and 10 to 12% of total natural gas production ends up in a leakage. More than 50% of leakages on average take place during extraction. And if this is the case in a country like the US, which has good infrastructure, which has good monitoring, evaluating, regulating systems, then this is at least a yellow flag regarding future production in natural gas, just at least in terms of how we tend to equate it with climate change mitigation. Next one just shows largest emitters in the world. There, just so that we at OAS and Latin Americans, in fact, the Western Hemisphere, don't feel so bad. We're not, we're quite virtuous. There, what you see are projections, but all the way to 2015, you can see almost a 45-degree line, which is China and its CO2 emissions, followed by the United States of America, which has managed to more or less plateau at around 6,000 million metric tons of carbon per year. Further down is the OECD, which includes the United States of America, and all those lines underneath it would include big countries, big in terms of Latin America, like Brazil, like Mexico. In that sense, in terms of climate change, just to reiterate the point that Ramon made, our region can boast. No need to feel incredibly boastful about it, but we do have the cleanest energy matrix in terms of energy generation, thanks to all that big capital formation on hydropower, which is creaky, which is old, which nonetheless has made Latin America the largest generator per capita of hydropower anywhere in the world. Next one, please, which just shows per capita consumption of natural gas. And there what you see is the US and Canada within the Western Hemisphere being by far the largest within the Western Hemisphere. You see interesting complementarities. Many of you will have heard about recent agreements between Russia and China for Russia to export gas to China in terms of per capita consumption. From that graph, you can see that it makes sense. Coming back to the Western Hemisphere, you can see why Ramon's point regarding why Mexico is a big winner in the shale revolution, importing gas, which not only comes from the US, it probably also comes from Canada, can end up, in fact, feeding the ECPA, which at some point we hope will connect all the way to Colombia. If that is the case, then you will have a market not of 75, but probably of 110, 120 million individuals, which would be incredible for the region. Next one, just to look at just some drivers that might promote integration and might help to diversify lower sources for low carbon intensity. That was my topic. So let's go to number one, which is treaties, laws, and regulation. When it comes to multilaterals, that map simply shows the current Kyoto Protocol, and these are commitments for the years 2013 to 2020. Light green are those who have ratified but do not have any binding targets because we are developing economies. Orange, like the United States, countries that agreed to the agreement but never ratified it. Red, sadly, for a country with green credentials, green pretensions like Canada. Unfortunately, they renounced the protocol some years ago. The main issue here is that without mandatory caps, the likelihood of promoting low carbon will not be as high as, say, it is in those countries with the dark green, which are basically the European Union countries and Australia. The second best alternatives are regional or national rather than multilateral. And that is, in fact, what has been happening. Carbon markets have not taken off as rapid as we might have want them to, and some people say this is first and foremost due to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Before the crisis, the permits per ton of CO2 in the European market were around 15 to 20 euros per ton. This collapsed after the crisis. They haven't recovered even to double digits. They today are in the range of 3 to 5 euros per ton of CO2. So this is obviously a market that does not attract many buyers. There were problems in terms of oversupply of them within EU negotiations. If that is the best we have today, then the end result, at least as of today, is not very good. I would at least like to highlight a couple of other regional alternatives. There are some regional alternatives in the northeast of the US, in the west coast, which interestingly includes some Canadian provinces. So these are international agreements that have created carbon markets, carbon cap and trade. Alberta, for all the bad criticism it gets, has a carbon tax that people have to pay, and I think it's perfectly reasonable and logical for them to do. And then you have, of course, national alternatives like Costa Rica, which has a promise to become a zero-emission country by 2020. Will it happen? We don't know. We do know that more than 2/3, a bit like in Belize's case, of their energy matrix is made up of renewables, and they are trying to move very aggressively, particularly into transport sector, compressed natural gas for their public transport fleets to try to meet those demands. So from my perspective, multilateral, not so good. Regional, national, potentially better. Second driver, would be pricing. Prices drive human, individual groups, nations' behavior. Ramon Espinaza was referring to the price of the Henry Hub natural gas spot price in the US, which is the one in orange, which you can see at the very bottom. You can see that there's a big collapse, again, as a consequence of the 08-09 crisis everywhere, in the Asian, in the European, in the American markets. By the mid-2009, by 2010, you see a recuperation, a significant recuperation in Europe, in Asia. On the contrary, as the shale revolution gains traction in the US, you continue to see that price going down. This means that the US has an excess capacity. This means that you cannot ask the private sector to give gas for free. If they could, well, they'd rather export it to Japan, where they will get their best price. That's the blue line. But when it comes to energy diplomacy, when it comes to the types of issues that Ramon was referring to regarding Central America and the Caribbean, the US is today equipped with that capacity to at least make a difference on the margin. Third driver is financing, unsurprisingly, where, and several of you have mentioned that the area in the world, not in the Western Hemisphere, in the world that has the largest capacity to use natural gas is North America. And that has been driven by the private sector, not by governments. Now, there you have a combination of private sector participation, but private sector participation has wanted to come on board thanks to low taxation and light regulation. This does not necessarily translate into what we in Latin America tend to do, what's in our historical socio-political DNA. We tend to be more statist for a variety of reasons. I just put it up there in terms that certainly private actors will chase money. The rest of the continent needs to diversify its sources. You've got a variety of either multinationals through UNDP, IFIs like the IFC, the IDB, or big state development banks like BNDES in Brazil, which promotes not only big energy projects throughout Brazil, but also in Spanish-speaking South America, Peru. They used to in Ecuador, they fell out with Ecuador. But state development banks, and probably there, the three largest economies, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, would be the ones with the greatest capacity. Last of the drivers is infrastructure. This is an issue that Ramon was referring to, simply contrasting North America versus South America. Even if South America has incredible proven reserves of both conventional and unconventional gas, the resources on the ground, to be able to use those resources just by looking at these maps, you can tell that North America is incredibly much more nimble, capable of moving around the resource than South America. In South America, in spite of the fact that you have top 3, top 4 global unconventional shale gas resources, there is a need to invest in infrastructure to be able to emulate what's happening in North America. I think I'm coming to the end. And I will not say much because I didn't speak to Ambassador Mendez or to Ramon Espinaza before this talk or anything. There's no collusion at all here, but there is no question that CEPAC is a gold standard, at least in the hemisphere. This is a case study I've been teaching in my university for the last 5 or 6 years. As our convener has mentioned, it took 2 decades to put it together, simply to close the deal, seed capital, $500 million early on from the IDB, from the Spanish government, and from several Latin American countries. I think that CEPAC is a very good example because it helps to put into perspective the 4 drivers I spoke about. You need infrastructure, you need financing, you need treaties, laws, regulation, and you need pricing to make this happen. I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Francisco. And I think you put it very well there. It's the gold standard, and I think that's really what it is, and it shows it very well. And definitely diversification is something that we at the OAS, at least from the perspective of the Department of Sustainable Development and the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, foster and promote. And the governments become aware of this. But I think the 4 drivers that you mentioned definitely have a heavy toll on the right decisions vis-a-vis energy. So, and it's not just about the fact that maybe you can get financing from IDB or CAF or other organizations. Really, at the end of the day, it's the people and the private sector and the customers who pay for all these developments, which is something that also makes it all the more important to make the right decisions vis-a-vis energy. I would like to invite Lisa to offer her discussion, and she's going to talk to us about natural gas, LNG, and hydropower balanced energy mix in electricity generation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'll talk about a couple of points that came up that I agree with, but just go into a little bit more detail. So as a couple of the other speakers mentioned, hydro is a huge source of electricity in Latin America in the overall matrix, and that's one of the reasons why there's low per capita emissions in the region. According to a 2010 study, which is the most recent data that I have, hydro provided about 65% of electricity in the whole region, which is much higher than the average for the world is 16%. So it's really a significant difference. The main markets, the largest are Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, where it's all of generation is over 70% hydro. So hydro, in many ways, is a great source of energy. It's relatively cheap, relatively clean. There's some debate about whether it's totally zero carbon, but certainly extremely low carbon emissions. And given the increase in demand across the region for electricity, it's a very important source of energy. According to IEA forecasts, electricity demand will increase by about 2 to 2.5% annually over the next 30 years or so. So when you take that in aggregate for the whole region, that's quite a lot. The tariffs, this came up a little bit, prices in some countries are very high. So in some of the energy poor countries like Central America and the Caribbean, prices are extremely high. And some of the more middle income countries that have more of their own domestic sources, the prices are more in line with the United States and other countries. Also, just to demonstrate that hydro is such a cheap form of electricity, there was a study from Navigant Consulting and ACOR that showed that levelized or long-term costs of electricity from hydro are about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. That would compare to gas, which is about 6, coal about 7.5, nuclear 9.5. So when you take into account the whole scheme and time period, hydro is relatively cheap. And there's still a lot of potential for increase. In terms of the resource, there's still a lot of potential in the region for building new dams and increasing capacity of hydro. But there are also a lot of problems with hydro, and that's one of the reasons why Ramon mentioned that gas is going to be a really important substitute, or certainly at least a complement. So one issue is that as a result of climate change or possibly other factors, there's been a change in the fluctuation of weather patterns. So there's been increasing droughts or just longer dry periods, and so that means in certain countries affected by El Nino, like for example Colombia or Brazil, there's been very dry periods where hydro reservoirs are getting really low, and so it's not the extremely secure energy source that it seemed to be until now. And also there's a lot of concerns about large hydro dams. There's been environmental protests, so despite being a clean energy source, it's not necessarily seen as an environmentally friendly energy source. And there's also a lot of social concerns. Large hydro dams require displacement of people, large communities of people sometimes. And there's been, in Brazil, for example, a lot of hydro dams being built in the Amazon, and there's been a lot of opposition to that. And just one example, recently Chile, they were going to build Hidroaicén, which was going to provide a huge source of electricity for a country that has basically no fossil fuel sources, and the government, in the end, just recently said that they're not going to build it at all. There were a lot of protests, there were a lot of concerns about the environmental impact, and that's just one example. And that's happened in other places too. And there's concern about how the dams affect aquatic life and other natural life. And so that's one of the reasons why gas is looking like a more attractive option for Latin America, because of some of the problems with hydro. So there's been increasing gas demand overall in the region, and that's mostly coming from electricity demand. Gas demand increased by around 60% in the region between 2000 and 2012, so that's quite significant. And by 2030, the IEA projects that gas will represent about 30% of the total energy matrix for the region. And that's mostly, about half of that is going to come from power generation. But in terms of domestic production, if in the region as a whole, the reserves are huge. I mean, Venezuela has huge gas reserves, and many other countries do too. But the outlook for production is not that favorable. So a lot of countries are looking more and more to LNG imports and also pipeline imports. So the largest holders of gas reserves are Venezuela and Argentina, but because of the regulatory structure and other issues there, they really haven't been able to produce more. 2/3 of Latin American gas production growth is expected to come from Brazil, and then there'll be some modest increases from Bolivia, Peru, Venezuela. Trinidad and Tobago is actually seeing a decline in production and reserves, and that country's traditionally been a very important source of gas for the region. So at the same time, the market for LNG is growing. There are 6 countries in Latin America, or 5 countries in Puerto Rico, that operate a total of 12 LNG facilities. So the main ones are Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile have multiple LNG regasification terminals. And then Peru and Trinidad are also exporting LNG. And there's also significant imports through pipelines, particularly Mexico, which is importing more and more gas from the United States. But if you look at the whole picture globally, Latin America is still a very small market for LNG. There's some, other than South America and Mexico, it's really insignificant. So as of 2011, Latin America accounted for only 7% of global LNG exports and only 3% of imports. And I wanted to talk about a couple of specific countries. I won't go into the Caribbean and Central America, which have already been talked about a lot, but in terms of some of the larger economies, Brazil, for example, is an interesting case because hydropower is about 75% of total electricity generation, but it's been an increasing problem over the last couple of years with reservoir levels down. So over the last couple of years, Brazil has been dispatching gas-fired plants at maximum capacity for the past 2 or 3 years. And despite that, reservoir levels are very low. Stored energy is down to about 42% in this year of storage levels compared to over 80% 3 years ago. So there's really big concern there about the ability to rely so much on hydro. And there are all of the new generation capacity in Brazil, despite this, is still planned to be hydro. So actually, there is one other very large hydro plant, which is Belo Monte, and that's the 3rd largest in the world, and that's under construction in the Amazon. And so essentially, the government was planning to continue with hydro being the main source. Power generation from gas was only 5% in 2011. It's been increasing since then. But if you compare that to the US, gas is now about 30% of the matrix, and it's catching up with coal, and it's going to eventually surpass coal in the next couple of years. And in Brazil, it's much, much lower. So Brazil is now importing more and more LNG, and they also import a lot of gas from Bolivia. So 75% of gas imports are still from Bolivia. LNG is used in terms of the balanced energy matrix. LNG complements hydro very well because it's flexible. So Brazil, for example, has not wanted to sign any long-term contracts for LNG, even though that means that their prices are higher because they're buying on the spot market. they have flexibility. So when hydro is available, that they use it, and then they use LNG as a backup fuel. There's some possibility that LNG prices will start to come down. Brazil is paying about 14 to 16 million dollars per million BTU, which is close to Asian prices. It's quite high. There's some hope that over the long term, US LNG exports will mean that gas prices will come down. But that's probably not something that would happen right away. And I'd be curious to know what other panelists think about that. But that could have significant, over the long term, could have significant impact for the region in terms of gas imports. And I'll also talk just a little bit about Colombia. Colombia has sort of a similar situation where about 75% of hydro, of power generation has come from hydro, and gas generation is increased by about 20% from 2011 to 2012. But the government, again, is concerned about about hydro reservoir levels decreasing due to drought. And so, for example, this year they said that Colombia has been exporting gas to Venezuela. This year they said they're not going to be able to export any more gas to Venezuela because they need to keep the reserves or the production for themselves. And Colombia's gas production outlook is not that favorable. There's questions about how large their reserves are, how large production could be. And Brazil, similarly, although Brazil has huge amounts of gas offshore, they don't know exactly how much it's going to be. A lot of it in all of these countries is used for reinjection for oil production, and so what's left over for the market is less than that. And it's a similar situation in Venezuela. The oil industry consumes about 72% of the country's production. And Venezuela is actually, because of such a shortage of gas production for the domestic market, and because of, again, at times hydro being too low, they're actually having to use liquid fuels for power generation, which is really not optimal in terms of carbon emissions and in terms of cost. And just finally, I'll mention Chile, which does not have domestic fossil fuel sources. They have power consumption is increasing dramatically, particularly because they also have the mining industry, which consumes a lot of electricity in addition to their population. So demand from mining sector is expected to grow by almost 70%. They have put targets for renewables, and they're really trying to increase the renewables, especially wind. And the share of renewables in the matrix doubled over the last 15 years, but it's still only 4% of the matrix. So even if it grows very quickly, it's starting from such a low base. And so Chile has also been importing more and more LNG. And I believe that they actually just agreed that they'll be importing LNG from the US. So that kind of demonstrates what's happening in the US, the impact that it has for the rest of the region. So the other, I think I'll leave it there because I won't go further into Central America and the Caribbean, which were already discussed.
Thank you, Lisa. And it's interesting to see how markets and different countries react to changes in prices of natural gas and changes in availability of the resource. And I think that ties us a little bit to, you kind of asked the question, and I think Bill mentioned this at the beginning of his presentation. Obviously there has been an oversupply over the last years, and particularly I think the new developments, technological developments and breakthroughs, and the use of these non-conventional resources have brought prices down. So my question to you, Bill, is, we've seen natural gas prices dropping dramatically, particularly in North America over the last years. How long is this going to last, and what does this mean, or what what are the impacts of these changes for the Latin American and Caribbean markets, energy markets?
I think the impact on price in the U.S. will depend a great deal, in fact, worldwide on LNG exports, especially, I guess, to Asia and to Europe, but also to Latin America and Central America. So demand, as always, is going to have a lot to do with price. I think increasing regulation, although I don't see it going too far, I mentioned several of the problems that probably will ultimately be mitigated by regulation, will increase the cost of natural gas production to some extent. In the best of all worlds, and this is a bias, I suppose, on my part, gas will be increasingly relied upon in lieu of coal, and in some cases in lieu of oil, especially for transportation. And as that occurs, along with export markets increasing, I think we can see probably a more stable supply and price situation for the resource.
Yeah, and I think this also ties to something that I was going to ask Ramon a question, but since you brought up the issue of regulation, and I would like to ask Francisco, you're talking about mandatory caps and how they affect the price of gas and how they can affect the energy market. And what we've seen in 2009, I think, obviously, the financial crisis took a toll on the energy market. I think also COP15 in Copenhagen, I mean, I think many governments were ready to see a change. It didn't happen. So now, 6 years later, we're looking at post-Kyoto 2015. How do you think that can play with, what Bill just pointed out? I mean, is this going to be a next step that will provide a more impulse to natural gas? Is this something that is going to change the way countries regulate their energy sectors?
I think, it depends on which of the countries we zoom into. In general, I think that more than anything, it's been a relative scarcity or the incapacity to continue to think that hydro was the solution that God gave Latin Americans because we have all these waters, and that this would happen always. As Lisa pointed out, given that a very significant proportion of energy resources, hydro resources, go into power generation, the more erratic patterns of rainfall, of glacier meltdown, the last 10, 15 years have meant that some of these budgetary planning committees who get together, the finance minister, the energy minister, the urban planning minister, who thought that they had 2 + X, suddenly have found themselves in a deficit in the last decade in countries like Chile, heavily mining countries like Chile, as much as more industrial production, manufacturing countries like Brazil. So from that perspective, the crunch, the pressure is not so much coming from the side of regulation, of multilateral institutions, of the goodwill, the capacity to cooperate among nation states, as much as from the harsh reality of energy needs. In that sense, when you look at the Western Hemisphere, you look at a southern half that is relatively strained versus a northern half which is currently enjoying a renaissance, enjoying bountiful supply. The extent to which this can be realized, in as much as you have markets there, Lisa already mentioned Chile, desperate to import LNG, not only from Indonesia or Qatar, from wherever it can, will start importing from the US. I wouldn't be surprised if countries like Brazil also did. So in that sense, I think it's more the markets and the relative scarcity in the south versus the relative oversupply in the north that might drive things, rather than, unfortunately, the goodwill that organizations like this one were meant to create, to promote cooperation over conflict. In that sense, I think it's the markets that are forcing the decisions on particularly South America.
Thank you. And so speaking about the markets, and this is the question that I had for Ramon, I mean, you mentioned something, it's very interesting, the idea of the two hubs, both for Central America and the Caribbean. And so we're talking about Central America, two hubs in the north and the south, and then the same for the Caribbean, one in Trinidad and another in the DR. Is this something that is being thought through, like as a concept that will be deployed, or is this a theory?
No, it's a feasibility study that we just finished. For Central America, we started with 17 different options, and on just technical and economic merits, this is the one that would provide the safest and the cheapest solution. However, to be implemented requires a political decision of the different countries to do it, because again, you need cooperation. I mean, for Panama to have a plant of this size would mean excess capacity, and then for making economic sense out of it, and a plant that size for gas is the minimum you should have, or it's on the lower side. Then to make sense out of that plant, you need to export to Costa Rica and Nicaragua, and the same in the north. Then the studies are there. Again, this began in April last year, that we got a mandate from the presidents in the region, and we will present the results. Have not been presented as yet. We had the last meeting of the steering committee last week, and we approved the technical solution at the technical level, but now that has to be brought up to the ministers and eventually to the presidents to have a regional solution. The same would happen for the Caribbean. I would like to make just a comment on we don't have a world gas market as we have oil gas, a world oil market. And the reason for that is that it's very fragmented. You have actually three markets. You have North America, Europe, and Asia. The reason for that is the cost of transportation and the gasification facilities. And the reason why, I mean, you can imagine the reason, the margin for arbitrage when you can get gas at $4 in the US and sell it in Japan at 17 is fourfold. Then there are market forces that are bringing the Japanese price down and the US price will come up, and there will be convergence. For Japan, the reason is a legal reason. They still, for reasons of Japanese national security, the price of gas is linked to the price of oil. They haven't delinked that price. In the US, it is not anymore. I mean, prices have come down from $12 million BTU 15 years ago down to $4. And at that time, they were linked to oil. Oil had kept going up and gas coming down. And one reason why you have that is that because the US is still not, as Bill was saying, not realizing its export potential because of licenses. Just 2 companies have licenses to export gas from the US, and there are 20 in the process of being approved. Then, and you are transforming these gasification plants into liquefaction plants. Then, as soon as that happens, you will have plentiful of exports in the US, affecting the Far East markets. And the same you're having in Europe, where they are diversifying their sources of gas. First it was coming from the north of Africa, then from the Eastern Europe and Russia, but now they are developing a number of LNG terminals. Then there will be downward pressure on gas in Europe also. Then we don't have to see the present situation as being persistent over time, but there will be convergence and there will be some market dynamics bringing for the most expensive consumers prices down, and most probably there will be upward pressure in the gas for the US. But that's a market in process of development as such.
Finally, I would like to ask Lisa, you mentioned large hydro is not always seen as a very friendly option. So obviously, I mean, a lot of our region, many countries in our region, particularly in South America, have these tremendous hydro dams, and actually, well, Brazil still is building a new one right now, and well, you know, there was issues with displacements and some environmental issues. So, I mean, the reality is that in our region, some countries are paying something between 9 and 12 cents per kilowatt hour electricity, retail use, consumer. Other countries are paying 50 cents per kilowatt hour, plus, in some cases, a fuel surcharge. So some countries in the Caribbean are actually, consumers may be paying 60 to 70 cents per kilowatt hour. So in this context, and taking into consideration the limitations that, you know, can be seen in terms of environmental security vis-a-vis large hydro dams, how do you what's your view on the potential for creation of these markets and these hubs? Is this something that the countries would take well, or is this something that is realistic in terms of political decisions, really? Because technically it is very feasible and it should be done, but politics is not always in line with technical aspects.
Well, I think that, I mean, hydro, the countries that have large hydro and a lot of potential are also the ones that have large oil and gas reserves for the most part. So the countries, I mean, the countries of the Caribbean and Central America, there are a few countries in Central America that have hydro, but for the most part, that's not a great option in that area either. I mean, they have, you know, everything is sort of working against them. And then you have, the large countries have huge hydro possibilities and huge oil and gas reserves. And then, so I think that there's plenty of supply. I mean, you know, there's still some questions about how to make it actually economically feasible. But so I don't think hydro, for the most part, that's not an alternative for the Caribbean or Central America either. I mean, in terms of the politics, I mean, I don't know, but I think that if you look at CPAC and how difficult it's been and how long it's taken, you have to be, you know, not naive about the political challenges. But I mean, I don't think I could say one way or the other, but I would look at CPAC and say, you know, it's not so easy. And in integration in general, I mean, it's not just Central America. There's been discussion for a long time about integration of electricity, of pipelines, in many different countries in South America too. In some cases it's happened, in most cases it hasn't. And so the politics is very difficult.
Can I jump in with one comment? First of all, there's a piece of trivia that relates to what Ramon said in regard to permitting. In North America, producers have applied for export permits equal to all the world's current liquefaction capacity. So just interesting. One thing we have not talked about, I mean, I know you're getting the impression, I hope, that this is a very dynamic situation that we're in right now at this stage in the world's evolution. And my own feeling, especially because of the pressure of climate change, is that we have to accomplish an energy transition in the industrial world, certainly, faster than any other energy transition we've ever experienced. Typically 50 years or so. It has to happen much more quickly than that. And one of the other white swans that we haven't talked about are renewable energy, solar and wind and so on, and what influence they're going to have on the gas markets and oil markets and others. And I don't know whether any of you would like to kick in on that or anybody on the panel, but we have not talked about the market influence of those those particular types of fuels. Also, one of the other pieces of the dynamic dimension of what we're in is infrastructure, not just the investment, but the vulnerability of infrastructure. How much do we want to invest in central station power plants and transmission lines and even pipelines that are frail, vulnerable to cyber attack, vulnerable to physical attack, or to natural disaster damages? Very, very dynamic time, and I welcome conversations about that.
Yes, and actually, I would like to get some questions. Yes, the gentleman in the back, yes?
Good morning, and I think I should start by apologizing for being late, because I may have missed some things that I would have liked to hear. First, congratulations to the OS for putting on this rather excellent discussion. I am not too sure that I've heard whether our interest is developmental or whether we are simply interested in taking advantage of the latest market fad. This is important because when we bring things to the US, almost automatically, the interests of countries, the capacity of countries to make decisions is what seems, at least to me, uppermost. We're moving into a phase, and I think the point was made by several of the panelists, that the possibilities of the new energy options are such that you have a capacity, a means of almost overnight reversing the challenges that Caribbean countries, as mine, Dominica, has had over a long time. Right now, the Eastern Caribbean, the cost of energy, and I'm not just talking about gas, certainly electricity, is the highest probably in the world. That might be a little exaggeration, but I think it's almost close to the truth.
It is true.
So what is our goal? Is it energy independence based on natural resources that we find in our regions and in our nations? I, for example, missed any serious discussion about the potential for geothermal. And certainly in the energy mix that Dominica is considering, geothermal has to be there. Now, I am worried, and I'm asking the panel whether you are, that the romance around natural gas and you know, the U.S. new production of gas, whether that romance is actually threatening the rather serious investment that countries have made to promote energy independence. And again, the question is, what is important? Is it the development, which is a variety of things, or simply trying to get to our shores, our markets, the plentiful gas that is either there or there in potential from the United States? Thank you very much.
Oh, I apologize, Ambassador Charles from Dominica. I did not recognize you. But does anyone want to take the question?
I could.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. The case of geothermal in Dominica, which is a reality, is true. But not all countries in the Caribbean have that potential. There are, geothermal is the main source of electricity generation in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and somehow Costa Rica. But that's a natural endowment. Some countries have it, some not. It's very important in Mexico. And the reason for that is that whole area, that part of the isthmus is very volcanic, and then you have geothermal potential there. Dominica is the same case, but it's not the case in the rest of the Caribbean countries, neither of the rest of the Central American countries. It's not the case for Panama, for example. I believe the approach is not a fashion. It has to do with development. because the alternative we are facing now is to generate electricity in the most expensive way you can do it, which is out of liquid fuels in thermal plants. I mean, that's the case for Jamaica or Dominican Republic or Haiti, for that matter, where electricity is generated. They have a very tiny hydro plant, but the rest is and that has developmental consequences. I think I refer to the prices. Perhaps I don't know where you came after or before I spoke, but in the Dominican Republic the average price is 40 cents the kilowatt hours as compared to 12 in the US. Haiti is 36, Grenada is 34 as it is in Jamaica. Then reducing prices it has to have an important development impact, both in terms of domestic electricity use and also for your main source of revenue, which is the tourism industry, which is somehow very energy intensive because you have to, I don't know why, because I'm from the Caribbean, I'm from Venezuela, and I never had air conditioning at my place, but in the hotels they have air conditioning. I mean, we have such a nice weather, I don't know how. We open or close the window, that's all we have to do. But the tourism industry is like that. They need to freeze somehow, I don't know. I mean, they escape the winter in Europe to go.
It slows down the aging process.
Yes, I believe. They say the coldest city in Venezuela is Maracaibo, where the average temperature is like 38 degrees centigrade, because everything has air conditioning. No? Then it has a developmental impact, Ambassador. And it's not just that there is gas in the US. I mean, the key point here are the technical developments associated to the transportation of gas and the use of gas for the size of the combined cycle gas plants. I mean, those are the big developments. With or without plentiful of gas in the US, gas would have come to the region because of these new developments. They have been talking about gas in Central America for a number of years. There is a study in the bank from more than 10 years ago. And the thing is that they didn't have the technologies. They just had pipelines, which were very expensive to transport gas, I remember, from Venezuela to Central America. But now you have this small-scale LNG that helps for a solution. Then I think it's everything. And the bill mentioned non-conventional non-conventional renewable resources, but also there is a lot to be done from the efficiency side, and you are doing that in the Caribbean. And that, my impression, Ambassador, is that everything will add up. There is not either or. It's a non-zero-sum game for the magnitude of the problem. Then you can have non-conventional renewable resources, much larger efficiency, but first, and I would say foremost, substitute this very expensive and dirty generation out of liquid fuels. That the reason for that is, and I include myself in that, our lack of planning. We have been moving from emergency into emergency, installing these liquid fuel fire plants, and not tackling the problem of a larger scale solution with a cheaper fuel. I believe that's part of the solution.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to take it up sort of at a more theoretical level and talk about the development versus fad. One of the things I find very perplexing here in the United States, where I focus most of my attention, is that we have no roadmap to where we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Several other nations do, including some of the Caribbean nations, but our national policy, according both to the president and his opposition party, is all of the above, which is nothing. It's no policy at all. there's a problem that develops. There's several problems. First of all, we have a permanent challenge with climate change and temporary leaders who tend to not want to adopt their predecessors' programs. And so there's a problem of continuity. And somehow we need to engage processes in our countries to develop our goal for the future, to envision it very clearly, and to clarify the map on how we're going to get there. Are we going to have a down ramp for certain fossil fuels and an on ramp for other alternative fuels and efficiency? And too many countries don't have that roadmap. A second issue is the overall political stability. How do you develop that roadmap in a way that you have political sustainability? How do you engage people with many different viewpoints in that common goal? So we have to make tough choices. To go back to this all of the above policy, which is not a policy, we have to begin to make tough choices, and I think we need to do that very quickly, but all of them should be aimed toward the ideal of where we want our people to be. So I love your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh, fine. Thank you. I'm Eugene Nuri. I'm the ambassador from the Bahamas. This is very interesting, and I thought that this was the most excellent presentation. However, there are some questions that arise, because obviously we're talking here about long-term development. For example, if this seeming to me concentration of the supply chain mainly being from the United States, what happens 100 years from now when we've put all these dependent structures in place? I said 100, not necessarily that long. And the United States decides, well, look, we've got to cut some of the exports out to these regions that have become dependent on your supply. That's one. That's an argument, actually. The question itself is an argument for the local development of other types of sources. For example, in the Bahamas, I didn't hear any mention, perhaps I was late, I didn't hear that, but there is the factor, for example, of what we call the, not geothermal, but hydrothermal. We have one of the deepest parts of the ocean in the world, practically, in the Bahamas, the tongue of ocean, which is several thousand feet deep, and the temperature changes every 4 degrees, every 400 feet or so, 1 degree. So that in itself is a renewable, clean, 100% clean source of both electricity and also of fresh, clean, cold water down at the bottom. So I think that I'm listening to this, but I think that some consideration ought to look at this as another form of alternative energy. Again, dependent on US technology, obviously, and deep pockets of the world, because the cleaner the source of the energy is, then the better it is for all of us, including possible exports, since the Bahamas is the third border of the United States, to the United States. So I think that, and then I didn't hear any mention at all about what about the potential. I heard Europe, Asia, and United States. What about Africa in terms of the sources of energy for the world? And looking at some of my statistics, I think the potential there is incredible. I just thought I would throw those points out for possible discussion.
If I can jump in, and I think we all agreed that we'd love to have you all talk to each other as well, but so I don't want to dominate, but I think it's important to realize in terms of fads that there's not a stereotypical way to reach energy independence or a clean energy economy, that every state in our union, every region of the world, every island has its own unique resources, its own unique political forces, its own unique climate, prospective climate changes to deal with. And that suggests to me that every country's energy mix has to be customized for that country. So I think the natural gas fad can be a problem where people think, the way to develop is with natural gas, or the way to develop is with nuclear fuels. We join the club. when really it's, I think, a nation by nation and sometimes a state by state or region by region decision that has to be engaged. So thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, and congrats on an excellent set of presentations from you all. I think I hear in the interventions of the two ambassadors from the Bahamas and Dominica an underlying concern about energy security of the small island states in the Caribbean. If natural gas becomes a priority commodity from the suppliers in the north, presumably to the Caribbean, what does that do to the ongoing efforts of the Caribbean region to develop their own indigenous energy capacity and the investments that are required to do that? As has been done now in geothermal in the case of St. Lucia and Dominica, which are the two primary proponents of that resource. And that is a real concern, because so long as the countries are kept in that logjam of dependence and are not able to develop their own indigenous supplies, there's going to be that continuing dependency syndrome perpetuated there. Presumably, natural gas is going to be cheaper than the alternatives that they're looking at now, at least in the short term. Dominica is now pretty well advanced with its geothermal energy plants. They now have established commercial quantities of the product and so on. They would need at least $300 million to develop this plant. St. Lucia will probably need a similar amount. But for the small island states in the Caribbean, the key issue in renewable energy for us is foreign exchange conservation. We have, at most, and Barbados is struggling with this problem now, Barbados has about 6 weeks of foreign exchange cover. 6 weeks. And the more the energy consumption eats into that, the more precarious the economies of the countries become. So I'd love to hear your reactions to that.
Can I start? Just trying to aggregate the three concerns which share a core. I think there isn't such a strict trade-off between, at least today, given technical innovations, given the usage of fossil fuels, in particular natural gas, and renewables. Today's combined cycle plants are able to use natural gas as a supplement to other sources, and the sources can be photovoltaic, the sources can be wind, and you use the gas when the wind is not blowing, the sun is not shining, and you've run out of that excess stored capacity. So there is definitely a trade-off regarding, as the director of the initiative mentions, at least in the short term, the price differential. Currently, if Henry Hub is costing $4 per million BTU, and it's exported to Central America or to the Caribbean, it probably will crowd out renewable alternatives. Renewable alternatives in the short term will not be competitive given that. In the very short term, nonetheless, and given such financial strains as have been depicted, I'd say that one of the top priorities for any planning commission in any of your nation states would be, we don't want to pay 70 cents per kilowatt hour. We want to pay less. If natural gas is going to do that, coming from Venezuela, coming from the US, coming from Trinidad, coming from Nigeria, so be it. And thanks to the technical innovations that we have, it means that not today, but at least in the medium term, you can continue. You will need subsidies, you need special treatment, you will need buffers against the market, but you do not have to turn your backs against renewables. It's not an either or. Natural gas is a very malleable type of fuel, which in fact is especially useful for those types of renewable energies that are not consistently taking place, like solar or wind. It's the best combination, the best fit combination, natural gas plus a given renewable. In the very short term, there is a problem, and it would be foolish and naive just to say, let's hope for the best. I do think that most people in the Caribbean do not want to pay 60 or 70 cents per kilowatt hour, and if natural gas will do it, if you want it to come from Nigeria, then Nigeria exports LNG, so it doesn't have to be the US.
Looking at the bright side, and not that paying 70 cents per kilowatt hour is anything, there's nothing bright about it. I mean, it is what it is. However, I mean, what you're pointing out is a fact. I mean, you are talking about countries where already most renewable energy sources are already profitable from the point of view of investment. So, and I think, and you also point out something very true, which is the fact that these, I mean, except with the exception made of geothermal, and in most cases hydro, although, we've seen cases in Brazil in 2001 and even today where we see the reserves going down, intermittency is a huge issue for renewables, and that's where you can inject these sources, and gas would fulfill that specific aspect quite well. It would fit well within a well-thought, well-designed energy map, which is something that was brought up also. And I guess each country has to kind of build their own fate and write their own books and make sure that they do things the right way. And I think definitely a combination and diversification of sources is what makes it easier. Yes.
I want to make a comment on that, and excuse me. I cannot think of a single country in Latin America and the Caribbean and almost the Western Hemisphere that is energy independent. Brazil imports gas from Bolivia, and liquefied natural gas, imports oil products because they don't have enough refining capacity. Colombia is a country that is very close to being self-sufficient. They do not import primary energy, but import 2/3 of the products they consume. Venezuela imports gas from Colombia and products from the United States, needless to say, Central America or the Caribbean. Then this idea, Mexico is very energy dependent from the US. Then this idea of energy, the US is not energy independent and will not be energy independent in decades to come, because you consume 17 million barrels of oil per day in this country they consume. They are producing now around 8, they import around 10. They could increase production by 3 million barrels over the next 5 to 10 years, still importing 7 million barrels of oil per day, you see. Then this idea of energy independence is a chimera for any country, let alone the small countries. And that depends on your endowment of natural resources. Then sadly enough, I mean, the Caribbean countries do not have enough indigenous sources of energy to supply the demand of a population that, thank God, is increasing in their income per capita year after year. Then there is not enough wind or solar or geothermal. You depend on other hydropower. Then you will depend, like most countries depend on thermal energy. That's a reality, but no country on earth, I would say, is independent of that reality. Perhaps Norway, I would think of, because they have huge hydropower, you see, to generate electricity. But it's a tiny country. Well, tiny depends on the standards, but it's 4 million people. You see, then this idea of energy independence, it depends. And the whole concept of self-sufficiency is very dynamic. Then let's hope for the best solution in the short to medium term, and also plan for it's a bad joke, but as Keynes said, in 100 years, all of us will be dead. Then but that's a reality. We don't know how the world will be in 100. We don't know. I mean, I went to university in Europe 20 years ago, and I wrote letters to my mom. I mean, talking on the phone was too expensive, you know, and I keep those letters. And that was 20 years ago. We don't know how the world will be in 100 years from now.
Yeah, I think it's safer maybe to speak about energy security. I think the ambassador wanted to make a comment.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have two questions. I was reading some literature on the subject of natural energy and how if countries decide to make the investment to retrofit the facilities, you're talking about a massive national refurbishment of everything we know. Everything from the stations where the gas will be unloaded and regasified or stored to the generators that will produce the energy. I don't know if also to the transmission grid. I don't know if that is included. But what we're talking about is a massive investment, practically starting from zero. Because if you look at the existing infrastructure in many of our countries, it is very, very old. So can anybody give us an idea about the numbers we're talking about? And also, if there is the thought that in the coming few years, the technology will enable a hybrid sort of input. So you can run a generator both with natural gas and with diesel. Because I think that the smart thinking is in a diversified matrix. You cannot depend only on natural gas, only on diesel, only on solar, only on wind. It has to be diversified. That's one question. The other one is, you know, in Belize, I mentioned earlier, our electricity consumption, the production comes 65% from renewable already. It's hydro and biomass. But if you look at the macro energy consumption, about 70% of it comes from fossil fuels, and that is because of the load in the transport sector. So what is being done in that area? And if you think about the Caribbean, one of the big problems, one of the big obstacles for development is really the transport and the connectivity, getting from one island to the other one. And it is expensive because most of the vessels operate with diesel. So that is another huge burden on the region, and it's a real burden on the economies. Could you talk a little about that? Thank you.
I have a number. Perhaps I can answer that part. We prepared an exercise at the IDB a few months ago, 4 months ago, on LAC 2025. And I made some back-of-envelope estimates. We're refining with my team those numbers now. But to supply incremental electricity demand to 2025 will require investments in the Latin American and Caribbean region in the order of $200 billion over the next 10 to 15 years. That's the number we're talking about. For the exercise, we assume maximum development of renewable sources, hydro, wind, and solar, and fill up the gap with gas. And those are the numbers we're talking about. I mean, those are large amounts. And the countries don't have the savings. Then the political solution is complex, because for that you will require private investment. And there is always this nationalism, particularly in the energy sector. Then you have to open up. Otherwise, there is no easy solution. I mean, that's the point.
There's a movement afoot to generate $1 trillion a year of investment over the next 25 or 30 years. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but it signifies a huge global investment to get to where we need to go in terms of a low-carbon economy. In transportation, I know in this country and many others, there's all kinds of research going on advanced biofuels, for example, cellulosic ethanol, and many other types of fuels. The thing to watch out for is what I call problem switching, where where you choose a fuel like liquids from coal, for example, in this country for the sake of reducing oil imports, and you create a whole new set of problems in regard to water consumption and carbon emissions. So you have to make sure your choices don't have unintended consequences or create more problems than they solve. But there's a lot of work being done here, I know, on transportation, and perhaps some of it transferable.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there are a lot of different solutions, alternatives for transportation. None of them, it's not as diversified as with electricity, where you really have so many different options. It's still dominated, by gasoline and diesel. But there's, other than biofuels, there's also electric vehicles. There's also natural gas vehicles. So, and different countries have gone further in these technologies, depending on the country. So certain countries in Latin America, use of natural gas vehicles is pretty extensive. In the US, it's not really ever taken off, despite discussion for a long time. But there are alternatives, and in some countries they've proven successful. And I think with public transportation, it's a good opportunity for some of these alternative technologies, because you can really have a whole program mandated at the government level.
I think Argentina is one of the countries with the largest natural gas fleet. Mostly actually it's private and taxis.
Taxis.
Not so much the buses. They were never able to make the buses switch to natural gas because of the investment.
Peru
that would be
and
something
Brazil.
nice to see in the United States. Go ahead, sorry.
Peru and Brazil also are part of that list of countries where compressed natural gas is used quite extensively, and the growth in the rate of renewed fleet is in that direction of using compressed natural gas rather than gasoline or diesel. As Lisa was saying, probably the biggest bang for the buck would be big projects where you transform public transport fleet. That is one of the factors which is behind the success of allowing Mexico City to not remain the most polluted city in the entire planet. There are a couple of others, like using high-octane gasoline, but switching the public transport fleet from diesel to natural gas, compressed natural gas, was one of the big factors behind it.
Well, I have a question related specifically to fracking. Just assuming that fracking developments are driven by markets, by prices, so fracking is going to happen anyways. So it's related to the area on risk management, specifically on health issues. For example, there has been evidence that benzene, for example, is one of the chemicals that is dissipated into the air, and it causes cancer. There have been some studies, for example, in Colorado and other places, in which there are fears of fracking, and also the other exposure route is water. So my question is not to try to mess up with the conversation, but just to give some thoughts on, is this the responsibility of policy, of federal governments, of companies, on it's just to give an exchange of ideas in order to try to have the countries to prepare to what is coming up. And also if there is a specific studies and cost benefits analysis that try to value the exposure of human health and human lives or here and there, I will appreciate that.
Okay, before you take Andre's question, we have a networking reception following this that you may have missed in your programs. So I just wanted to remind you of this. And very quickly to follow up on the comment that Ramon made, I take your point on the dependency situation. I did not mean to suggest total dependence or independence. But in the Caribbean, dependence equates with vulnerability. The more dependent you are, the more vulnerable you are. And that was the context in which I posed it. I wondered if you had a ambassador from Bahamas raised the issue. He suggested OTEC as being one of the prime opportunities for the Bahamas. Do you have any information on the evolution of the technology on this?
I don't. I don't, unfortunately.
I can take a shot at the first question, sir, in the pink shirt. I think the solutions, I think the production has gotten ahead of the technologies, which have gotten ahead of public policy. And I think it's going to be a combination of voluntary efforts by the industry to maintain that social license to operate and government. We talked to many people from the U.S. gas industry, and their position is that they welcome regulation, reasonable regulation, for a number of reasons. It takes away the bad actors out of the industry. It prevents those who are doing nefarious production things to gain an advantage in the marketplace from doing that. And it builds public trust. So I think we're going to need to see not a single solution, but a combination of government regulation and industry collaboration and technical development to solve these problems. And I'm glad you raised water, big issue, especially in Colorado, where I'm from. It's going to restrict, I think, water is going to have a big bearing on our energy choices in the future. We're going to be, I think, especially in arid regions, we're going to be forced into choices for resources that do not consume or that learn to recycle water resources.
No.
So we're going to take one last question, or not.
Just wanted to follow up with his question. Does anybody have any reports that they would like to recommend about the valuation, cost benefits, things of that nature of fracking?
It's a very big weak spot. This full cost life cycle accounting just is not practiced in the United States, I know. There are a number of ongoing studies, however, about the risk management factor that are folding in public health. The Environmental Protection Agency here has generated a tool called the social cost of carbon, where you can calculate the public health and other risks associated with carbon emissions. There is a series of ongoing studies in the United States about fracking and about leaks, methane leaks in particular, being done by the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, in conjunction with several universities in the United States. And that is a 2-year, I think a 2 or 3 year research window, but you may want to Google on that to see what those studies are finding. They're comprehensive, and they're turning out to contradict a lot of what the EPA has said about these problems.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank our speakers for today. I think this has been a very interesting conversation, and I hope that you've always all been able to take advantage of it. I'm going to ask our speakers to stay around for a few minutes so that if you have questions or you would like to approach them or talk with them, feel free to do so. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.